Uncovering history, the founding fathers and those in their shadows. Benedict Arnold, a traitor among us. By June of 1778, Henry Clinton replaced William Howe as the top general of the British military in America. One of Clinton's initial commands was the evacuation of the British military from Philadelphia, along with some 3,000 civilian loyalists. This massive transport of both civilians and military were heading 100 miles north, with New York City as a final destination. Since the initial battle of the war, the American forces relinquished the city, and New York had become a British safe haven from any American threat. While the journey was not particularly long, Clinton and his army were now being weighed down by thousands of men, women, and children, with the looming threat of the Continental Army pursuing them. When news of the British evacuation of Philadelphia reached the ears of Washington, Washington had a decision to make. Do they attack the fleeing British, or simply let them retreat with no impedance? Questions of what to do if a possible British evacuation of the city were to take place had been swirling around in Washington's head for several days prior to the actual withdrawal. So Washington assembled his top generals to assess the situation. During the council, some proposed that the Americans attack and harass the British, who were highly vulnerable and on the move. And truth be told, General Clinton's army and the train of civilians that were with him were extremely vulnerable to an all-out attack. In fact, had Clinton been at Washington's War Council meeting, he would have freely confessed they were easy prey for the Americans to wage a successful attack. However, other members of the War Council, such as Charles Lee, suggested that the Americans not pursue the enemy. Lee, who had previously been captured by the British, being held prisoner for the last year and a half, was recently released when Washington and Howe agreed upon a prisoner exchange for him. When Lee was released and returned to his command, he was warmly welcomed back by many. However, some questioned his authenticity and commitment to the American cause, believing that Lee had betrayed his country while imprisoned by giving the British vital intel that could greatly impact or even end the war. The origin for this belief was based on Lee's unwillingness to attack the British as they evacuated Philadelphia. Also, his lack of advice and support, and that much of the language he used implied that an American attack against the British was not wise. To further question Lee's sincerity, when Washington requested Lee and his men to closely monitor the movements of Clinton and the British, Lee initially rejected the offer for reasons that are undisclosed. When Washington acquiesced to Lee's wishes, the role was then delegated to Lafayette, who would now command half of the army. Of course, upon hearing the news about his replacement, Lee quickly reversed course and accepted the position. The fact that Lee had such a negative outlook on the war and was indecisive became a prelude of things to come. This pattern of behavior even prompted a young Colonel Alexander Hamilton to scoff at Lee because of his childlike behavior and inept ability to lead. June 18th, 1778. Well before sunrise, the British army, along with a giant caravan of civilians and wagons, slowly began to make their way north towards New York City. It wasn't long after they exited the city that the sun began to peek over the eastern horizon, and the scorching heat began to take its toll. As the mercury quickly reached the upper 90s, it began to sap the energy of many, forcing the caravan to slow its pace to nearly a crawl. The journey became especially difficult for the soldiers, who were dressed in heavy military uniforms while simultaneously shouldering muskets along with 60-pound bags containing supplies strapped on their backs. As the hours slowly passed on this cloudless day, the heat claimed its first casualties when several Hessians wearing heavy linen uniforms suddenly fell to the ground and died from heat stroke. Not only was the heat and slow pace becoming a concern for Clinton, there was a constant concern and fear of an American attack. Clinton strongly believed that Horatio Gates's army was moving from the north to the south and would attack his vanguard head-on, while Washington and his army converged on them from the south and possibly engulfing the entire British company. Clinton initially proposed splitting their caravan into two parties, traveling parallel to one another, but soon decided that it was in their best interest to keep the wagons and troops together as they slowly marched on, with a small detachment led by General Cornwallis, with grenadiers following behind. June 25th. General Clinton and his entire caravan headed northeast towards Monmouth Courthouse, traveling on a smoldering summer day. Not far behind him was General Lee and his men, with Washington about a mile behind them. Monmouth, where the battle would soon take place, was not an ideally situated battlefield, as it was littered with steep ravines and enormous pine trees. As General Lee and his men closed in on the British to attack, it was not clear how the initial engagement with the British unfolded, but Lee and his army were suddenly confronted by Cornwallis along with his detachment. As the two sides began to exchange fire, only after a few short minutes, Generals Maxwell, Scott, and Wayne unexpectedly withdrew their troops in a somewhat formal retreat. Part of the reason for this sudden pullback of the troops was Lee never dispatched any formal orders of attack, which quickly caused chaos and confusion among the men. The most puzzling aspect of the whole event is that the American army wasn't under any serious threat from the British and likely had the upper hand. As the army retreated back towards Washington, they were soon confronted by him. A bewildered Washington was taken back as to why his men were retreating. Moments later, Washington crossed paths with a retreating Lee, who uttered nothing but, "Sir, sir." Not wasting a moment to lash out on Lee for the disaster he caused, Washington immediately did what he was best at doing, restoring order. And within moments, Washington had command of his army and was ready to face the British. As the two sides engaged one another, there was a heavy volley from both musket and cannon fire that would continue for hours. Had Clinton and Cornwallis been tactical as they had in the past by flanking the Americans, they may have posed a significant threat to Washington and his men. Instead, they opted for a head-on death strike. It was a mistake that would cost them dearly. As Knox and his men soon flanked Cornwallis's army with field pieces, Washington and his men burrowed down into a solid defensive position. Soon, cannon fire and grape shot erupted from Knox onto the British, cutting down many. Losing badly and now desperate, Cornwallis ordered a charge on Nathaniel Greene's men, only to see most of them cut down by a barrage of musket fire. After several hours of fire, both sides were succumbed to the extraordinarily hot weather, and the fighting ceased. An eager Washington desired to finish Cornwallis and the British off the next morning, but Cornwallis pulled a trick from Washington's playbook and secretly evacuated his entire army to safety that night. Shortly after the Battle of Monmouth, Washington demanded answers for the inexplicable behavior of General Lee and his failure to engage Cornwallis and the British. After being court-martialed because of his conduct, Lee was found guilty on all accounts, in that while he was given direct orders to attack the enemy, he instead retreated in a disorderly manner. Lee was also guilty of disobeying orders and disrespecting the commander-in-chief. While Lee was a disappointment for Washington and the cause, something far worse was about to happen. One of the most perplexing individuals of the Revolutionary War, without question, is Benedict Arnold. Born in 1741 and growing up in Norwich, Connecticut, Arnold was described as short, with a muscular build, and highly energetic. He was a handsome man with black hair, gray eyes, and was said to excel in athletics. Prior to the Revolution, Arnold worked both at an apothecary and as a seaman. Arnold's demeanor and personality were similarly complex and interesting. He was described as extremely sensitive to any form of critique, with a short, fused temper that could explode at a moment's notice. It was said, if you criticized Arnold, he would make the individual pay dearly for doing so. On one occasion, James Easton called into question Arnold's naval skills, to which Arnold was said to have kicked him very heartily, to the point where Easton would never forgive him for what he did. By 1770, when news of the Boston Massacre reached the ears of Arnold, he proclaimed, "Good God, are the Americans all asleep and tamely giving up their glorious liberties?" And when news of the shot heard around the world in Lexington reached Arnold, he quickly dashed off with the militia to fight against the British. And when the Revolutionary War officially began, Arnold, a committed patriot, quickly established himself as a brave soldier and a man of war, moving through the military ranks because of his courage and valor. During a battle in Quebec, fighting alongside an equally egotistical Ethan Allen, Arnold fearlessly rode into battle, but was subsequently wounded by a musket ball in the leg. Later, during the Battle of Saratoga, Arnold was again severely injured from a musket ball wound in the same leg. However, this time as the musket ball whistled through the air, it struck and shattered the femur bone just above Arnold's knee, shattering the bone throughout the area. The injury sustained was so severe, it was believed his leg would need to be amputated. But after months of recovery, the leg slowly healed, but he would walk with a limp for the rest of his days. Because of his courage, Arnold became a household name and was deemed by many as the unsung hero in the battle. At this point in time, had Arnold been fatally wounded in battle, his name would be mentioned among the founders, with streets, cities, and counties named after him. During his time away from home, tragedy, not from war, would strike Arnold's household as his wife suddenly passed away, leaving Arnold to support his 3 children. In an attempt to block out his tragic loss, Arnold continued to fight, sending his 3 children to be raised by their aunt. Trying his best to cope with the devastating loss, Arnold fought hard. He would later write, "An idle life under my present circumstances would be but a lingering death." While Arnold acted heroically on the battlefield, not long thereafter, several charges of corruption were leveled against him while in Philadelphia, which Arnold dismissed as malicious and false. The charges were later dropped, but Arnold became embittered towards his comrades. To further exacerbate matters, while many others were moving up in rank, Arnold became frustrated with Congress and other military generals who often overlooked him for less qualified candidates. Soon, Arnold did the unthinkable. Believing that he was so underappreciated by Congress and others, Arnold betrayed his country. The exact origin of Arnold's betrayal is not known for certain, but it likely began shortly after the Battle of Saratoga and reached fever pitch while in Philadelphia alongside many loyalists, especially the beautiful Peggy Shippen, who he would later marry. It is speculated by some that Miss Shippen played a critical role in persuading Arnold to cross over to the British and betray his country. Washington, who often sympathized with Arnold, always appreciated Arnold's commitment to the cause and would soon give him an opportunity to take a real leadership role by appointing him to oversee and command the strategic fort, West Point. However, prior to becoming the commander of West Point, Arnold had already began interacting with the British and Colonel John Andre. While General Clinton and Colonel Andre were busy fighting in the South, Arnold had been secretly exchanging letters with the men using the alias Mr. Moore. In one letter, Arnold stated that he anticipated West Point would be under his control very soon. Arnold also told Colonel Andre that the American cause was on its deathbed, and by betraying his country, he hoped many others would follow and thus restore order in the colonies. Andre, who also had previous ties to Peggy Shippen while in Philadelphia, was now making arrangements to meet Arnold about troop movement and weaknesses within the fort, making it highly vulnerable to an attack. Eventually, Arnold agreed to share the plans of West Point to the British for an agreed sum of money, and was even willing to possibly deliver Washington to them for a ranking position in the British Army. When an agreement was finally reached, the British ship the Vulture slowly glided up the Hudson River into a neutral area across from Joshua Smith's home, carrying Major John Andre and Beverly Robinson. That night, Andre would meet Arnold face to face, and the terms of the agreement would be forged. The discussion between the two men went on for hours, right up until the sun was about to rise. Not being able to finish their discussion, the two men decided that Andre would stay with Arnold at Smith's home to resume the conversation and leave later that evening. However, as the sun rose and the vulture became visible, the Americans began to fire at it, hurling cannonballs through its sails, causing the captain to retreat further downriver. Andre could only watch with dismay as the vulture sailed away, greatly increasing his odds of being captured. Traveling back to New York City via land was not safe for a British soldier in enemy territory. Not only were there American sentry posts everywhere, the land was rampant with skinners and cowboys. As the vulture sailed off to safety, Andre knew his capture would mean certain death. Under the cover of darkness, Andre would leave with the blueprint of West Point tucked into the bottom of his boot, along with other documents. Arnold assigned Smith to be his guide with a letter signed by Arnold stating that Andre was on urgent official business, and in the event they were stopped, the letter would provide safe passage. Andre would also remove his British military uniform, swapping it out for an outfit from Smith's wardrobe. As the men mounted their horses and began their journey, the first encounter they had was before King's Ferry, where a group of American soldiers were sharing a bowl of rum. Andre lowered his head and slowly rode ahead, while Smith stopped and indulged in some rum around the fire. Catching up with Andre, Smith was in much higher spirits as the men continued on. After crossing the river via the ferry, the men soon encountered Colonel James Livingston, who earlier that morning was responsible for firing the cannons at the vulture. Livingston thought it quite dangerous for the men to be traveling at night, and insisted that they stay at his place for dinner and resume their travels in the morning. But Andre knew that time was of the essence, and every moment they lingered and every question they were asked was further putting his life in jeopardy. After nearly 8 miles of travel, they were stopped yet again by a group of American soldiers, but this time they were being thoroughly questioned. Why were they traveling at night, and what was the nature of their business? Smith later wrote that Andre grew intensely nervous, but was assured by Smith that their letter from Arnold would provide safe passage from any trouble. And the letter did provide passage, as the men were allowed to continue on. Early that morning, the men made it to the neutral zone where they would part ways. Smith implored Andre to take the inland route so as to avoid cowboys. Cowboys were British loyalists. Smith, however, did not know that Andre was a major in the British Army, so cowboys were actually his friends. Needless to say, Andre avoided Smith's advice taking the inland route, making a final gallop to Post Road where Andre would finally be safe. A tall man suddenly jumped out of the bushes with his rifle, aimed at Andre and yelling at him to stop. The man was dressed in a Hessian soldier's uniform, which was a breath of fresh air to Andre. Suddenly, several others emerged from the woods surrounding Andre. "My lads," Andre exclaimed, "I hope you belong to our party." "What party?" the Hessian replied. "To the British Loyalist Party," Andre said. "We do," the soldier replied. Andre sighed in relief, and a smile flooded across his face. At least he was safe. "I'm a British officer," Andre shouted, "and I'm on very important business and wish not to be detained for a moment longer." At that point, they told Andre to dismount his horse, and as he did, they revealed, "We're Americans." Andre replied with a smile, "No doubt." As it turned out, these men were not cowboys or Hessian. They were American soldiers dressed in enemy uniforms that had seized these several days prior. Andre, with a blush and now nervous, smiled and said, "Of course you are." At that moment, he handed the men Arnold's pass as a last resort to cross safely to British soil. The men looked at the note, stating that it seemed to be authentic, but wanted to check Andre for anything suspicious. As the men frisked Andre, nothing suspicious was found. One of the men suddenly said, "Take your boots off too." Andre complied, slowly removing his boots. Everything looked fine. But as Andre was putting his boots back on, one of the men noticed his sock was sagging. "What's in your sock?" he yelled. Instantaneously, they seized the contents within Andre's sock. Scanning the papers, the soldiers screamed, "He's a spy!" Andre was mortified. He had come within a hair's breadth of making it to New York City, only to be stopped by some hillbillies who in all reality and unknowingly saved West Point in the war. Andre was immediately arrested as a spy, and the penalty for being captured as a spy was death by hanging. Several days later, on September 25th, with Arnold having no knowledge of Andre's capture, Washington, Hamilton, Rochambeau, and Lafayette would be arriving shortly via boat to inspect West Point and see Arnold. The breakfast was arranged in honor of Washington's arrival and to be held at the Beverly Robinson house that morning. Washington would miss breakfast as he was inspecting the fort, but during breakfast, as everyone was gathered around the table, a courier burst through the door, delivering an urgent message to Arnold. Arnold wiped his hands with the napkin and slowly unfolded the note. As the conversation around the table halted, Arnold began to carefully read the contents of the letter to himself. Moments later, Arnold became nervous and visibly distressed, unable to shield his emotions from his company. The contents of the letter stated that a possible spy by the name of John Anderson had been apprehended several miles downriver, south of West Point, with a letter tucked inside of his boot containing vital information about West Point. Asking what the contents of the message were, Arnold began to stutter through his words and quickly excused himself from the table. Cognizant that he would be killed instantly if the plot was foiled, Arnold raced upstairs to both his wife and young child where they were resting. Arnold quickly kissed his wife, slipped out the upstairs window, and dashed off to the British ship, the Vulture, several miles downriver. The entire premise of Arnold's betrayal had been thwarted. Indeed, had the plans of West Point made it into British hands, Arnold would have thought himself as the individual that ended the war and restored peace among the mother country. Now, with much trepidation, Arnold had to board the Vulture and inform the British that Andre had been captured because the plan was not followed. There must have been a mass of thoughts swirling around in Arnold's head. What if the British sent the traitor back to the Americans? What about his wife and his child who were left behind? Now, Arnold was the most wanted man in America. At that single moment, Arnold must have felt like the loneliest person on earth. Within minutes of his arrival to West Point, and upon examining a packet of letters, Washington was informed that Arnold had defected over to the British. Immediately, Washington sent men in every direction in hopes of intercepting Arnold before he crossed into British safety. To no avail, the men returned that evening without the captured Arnold. Washington was aghast when the dust settled, as Arnold was one of his best generals. Surrounded by his colleagues and top generals at dinner that evening, Washington was an emotional wreck as he expressed anger and malice towards Arnold. And finally, holding back his tears, Washington said, "Arnold has betrayed us. Who can we trust now?"